Hi, this is Dr. David Pizzino. Welcome back to part 2 of General Considerations and Field Methods in Cultural Anthropology. We talked last time about some general considerations and left off with finds, 3 different approaches. We'll have 3 more models here to think about from Habermas's work. It's an off-cited piece in both anthropology and outside of it. In this piece, Habermas goes through 3 different models, the first of which is the natural science model, aka positivism, where the researcher generally remains absent from consideration. You see this in a lot of the writing in so-called scientific work, wherein the idea of I or we completely disappears, and things are written in an objective manner. The absence of individual, by rooting out these particular pronouns, this makes this work more scientific, of course, as well as adhering to a scientific model of hypothesis formation, isolating variables, testing for those, reporting on results after the test, and then disseminating those through appropriate venues. The historical and interpretive model of Habermas is in which social phenomena are described and their meanings and functions are further elaborated through balanced commentary and philosophical descriptions of the researcher. And finally, the critical theory model, wherein social life is analyzed and recorded for the political purpose of overcoming social oppression, particularly forms that reflect advanced capitalism through the overt polemics of researchers. Now, when we think about these different models here, what is the actual relationship of these 3 models? Are they necessarily mutually exclusive from one another? Is there a hierarchy in terms of which one of these models is more valued? And is this hierarchy an absolute hierarchy? In other words, is this a universal hierarchy, or is this a hierarchy within a particular cultural context? So these are all considerations that we have to keep in mind in the sort of the broader general concepts of cultural relativism as well as ethnocentrism in anthropology. And again, this reflects your own particular commitment as an ethnographer in producing anthropology. From a positivist, from a humanist framework, and different ideas of thinking about what anthropology is, what and how it should contribute to our knowledge in an academic sense, whether there's a strict separation of academic and applied knowledge, and also what are the potential political implications of our field work, and is so-called apolitical objective research or natural science type of research in itself apolitical? So these are some broader questions to think about as you move through and think about what it is that your commitments are as a person, as an individual, who you are, what you bring to the table, and what you want to contribute to the discipline of anthropology overall. Madison brings up the point that we need to both consider objectivity as well as subjectivity. And of course, the discussions about objectivity and considering this have been written about quite extensively within the field of anthropology. And some of this comes from critiques of anthropology, particularly early anthropology, which did serve to justify a hierarchical nature of society as a whole. And so when we think about objectivity, how does this tie in not only with the idea of science and doing science from the natural science model of things following Habermas, but also the legacy of colonialism? And it was the case that in the past there was a geographic division of labor between sociology and anthropology. The sociologists worked in so-called civilized societies, Western societies as a whole, whereas anthropologists were relegated to the so-called primitive societies. And today we see this sharp geographical divide no longer taking place. And in fact, this is no longer exclusively the discussions of just anthropology and sociology as well. We see many more disciplines contributing more overtly, more explicitly in the analysis of societies across the globe today. In the case of early ethnographers, a lot of this was armchair anthropology or armchair analysis, looking at culture from a distance. And very early accounts of ethnographers weren't based on field work. We think about this today, and we're, of course, teaching or a screencast here on the idea that you have to, as an anthropologist, go out into the field and do field work. And this wasn't always the case. As you saw in the past, there were questionnaires that were the main method of essentially gleaning information, gathering information. This was used by missionaries, traders, sailors, and colonial administrators who would basically give these surveys out. It was then sent back to the metropolitan areas, the colonial metropoles, and it was brought together for analysis by these armchair ethnologists who essentially interpret the results. And of course, these results were interpreted in service to the state as a whole. The critique, whether it's fair or not, is that anthropology was the handmaiden of colonialism, particularly the functionalists in the classic era in political anthropology. That anthropology was essentially utilized as a tool to be able to better understand peoples across the globe, to better be able to extract resources from these various locations across the globe. Hayden's early justification for an imperial bureau of ethnology in England. We see museums functioning in these early days to particularly the discussion of so-called natural history museums and looking at this from an evolutionary perspective, looking at the idea that human beings from a lineal evolutionary perspective were existing along a continuum from the so-called primitive to the so-called civilized, often occupied by the Victorian era, by the colonizers, by the individuals who are creating the museum to serve a particular purpose, to convey a particular aesthetics, a particular message to visitors, a message of nationalism, of cultural superiority, and so forth and so on. And we see, of course, this is not only isolated to museums, but also public events overall. The 1904 St. Louis World's Fair and the Olympics that were sort of a tag along to this. And one of the things that came out of this, the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, were the particular representation of the Philippines. And this was essentially used to justify essentially the colonial exploits of the United States and the Philippines. And at the end of the presentation, I'll provide further and additional reading where you can read more about this particular case study if you're interested in it. But it was this idea of dog eating in particular, and the sharp contrast to the regimented style and the discipline and the aesthetics of the U.S. military in particular, all under the same fair, right? In St. Louis, that sort of justified this colonial incursion, this quote unquote white man's burden at the time. What Madison points out, and others of course have noted, is that a lot of these ethnographers, these early ethnologists, they couched a lot of what it is that they were saying in terms of positivism, and that is that they were saying that they were doing science. Nevertheless, they had come to not necessarily consider reflexively the lens through which they were looking, the colonial logics, the idea of cultural superiority through which their objectivity was produced. Now, as Madison notes, these critiques of objectivity have been leveled quite extensively in the last several decades within anthropology as well as outside of it. But she also, or Madison also calls to mind here the idea of considering subjectivity, noting that we are now more critical of the subjectivity of subjective researchers and how subjectivity reflects upon its own power, position, choices, and effects. Further notes that we bring our own belongings into the field with us, not only the many others who constitute our being, but how we belong to what we know, how our epistemologies are yet another site of our belonging with, as well as for, others. Now, one of the things that is brought out here is that when we're doing what Madison would call critical ethnographic field work, this is not about exclusive experience as an ethnographer. In other words, the reflexive exercise, according to Madison, can be carried too far. And when it is carried too far, well, it's carried too far in the sense that it's no longer critical ethnography. That is, something else is produced. It's autobiographical. It's potentially travel writing, memoir, or what some in anthropology might call autoethnography. What Madison highlights here, and what others have highlighted before, is this idea of intersubjectivity, and also this idea of in how this is produced, how meaning is made in relationship, and understanding the self is made in the context of understanding ourselves in relation to others. And in this understanding, particularly in the human condition, the importance of language in terms of words, speech, act, performance, and that this dialogue is something which resists conclusion. In other words, this isn't absolutely fixed. It's a dialogue. It's continuous. As Madison notes and others have noted, this enhances our understandings of ourselves. And what this also does is it resists the timelessness or what has been historically referred to as the quote-unquote ethnographic present. That is the representation of a timeless account of the culture or people being studied. In other words, the culture as a whole versus the culture as the ethnographer engages with that culture and understands that culture. And there's a key difference here. Because we're not talking, as Malinowski might have, the Trobriand Islanders, but we're talking about a specific context, a specific type of engagement. And of course, it's this reflexive turn which gets us to think a little bit more about our methods, a little bit more about the limitations of our research, and what it is that we can accurately say based upon the work that we actually did. So in a lot of ways, this reflexive turn within anthropology as a whole has enhanced our ability to do positivist type of work. Now, theory and methods are intimately connected with one another. Critical analysis is grounded in social theory, ethics is grounded in moral philosophy, and performance is both a practice and a theory. In accepting the significance of theoretical knowledge, it is equally important for us to comprehend the way in which theory is at times the same as method, and at other times distinct from it. Theory can be used as an interpretive or analytical method, which may guide or inspire us. But theory, when used as a mode of interpretation, is a method, yet it can be distinguished from method, and indeed take a back seat to method when a task of concrete actions grounded in or by a specific scene are required to complete a task. Methods are contingent upon our purpose, our fundamental questions, the theories that inform our work, and the theme itself, and the scene itself. Theory and methods can also be at a distance from one another with concrete procedural models when logging data, coding, and designing questions. Coding would be looking at domains, clusters, and themes. I like this quote here that Madison includes from Rowe: "We are always inescapable from the theory we create. Who we love is political." Well, I hope to have provided you with a rundown of some general considerations in thinking about and getting started in doing ethnographic fieldwork in cultural anthropology. For further reading and sources, you can see these sources: Castro, Habermas, and Madison.